Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Abitchonistim. IDSF is the leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security-oriented policies to guide the state of Israel. Thank you so much to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing and our previous briefings to allow us to really bring you behind the headlines analysis of what is happening here in Israel during this war. It's a great privilege today to be joined by Asher Fredman, Director for Israel of the Abraham Accords Peace Institute, as well as the Managing Fellow at the Misgav Institute for National Security. Asher, thank you so much for joining me today.
Moshe, thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to join the IDSF Bitchonistim again for this briefing. What I want to do today is take a little bit of a zoom out and look at the war in Gaza, which I'm sure you've been dealing with quite extensively from the geopolitical and regional perspective. But I want to start from Prime Minister Netanyahu released last week his vision for Gaza the day after. And there were two elements in that vision that mention in a fairly opaque way the involvement of regional partners in Gaza on the day after. And I'll just sort of quote directly from those two sections. The Prime Minister wrote that they will advance an extensive and expansive deradicalization effort in Gaza with the involvement and the help, as insofar as it's practical, of Arab countries who themselves have undergone and have advanced a de-radicalization process in their own countries. And secondly, with regard to reconstruction, in Prime Minister Netanyahu's outline or plan, he says that reconstruction will only begin after demilitarization has been completed and de-radicalization has begun. And the reconstruction will happen with the funding and leadership from countries that are acceptable to Israel. I just want sort of to give the Rashi, the explanation regarding those two paragraphs, because they're quite important. With regards to de-radicalization, we have to remember that even in the UAE, which today really is an example, a model of tolerance and multicultural understanding, until about 30 years ago or so, the teachers were largely either Muslim Brotherhood or radical Palestinians in their school education system, in their legal system. And again, I think about 30 years ago, the Emirati leadership wisely chose to remove all of these extremist elements from their education system, from their judicial system, and to replace that with a culture of understanding and tolerance and respect, which eventually led to the Abraham Accords, the opening of the Abraham family house in Abu Dhabi. So there are examples of successful de-radicalization. Now, of course, the UAE is very, very, very different from Gaza on so many levels, but there are countries, Saudi Arabia is undergoing some very interesting and in many ways courageous processes currently of de-radicalization where we could learn. And regarding the second paragraph of countries that are acceptable to Israel, the reference I think there is largely to Qatar. And certainly from the point of view of Prime Minister Netanyahu, if we look at several recent statements he's made, I don't know if the same could be said for all of Israel's leadership, but certainly for Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's been a real change in approach towards Qatar and a public expression of the understanding that Qatar is a negative, radicalizing pro-Hamas force in the region, and that unless and until, if and when one day they change their ways and give up their support for terror and Al Jazeera's terror incitement, until that happens, if it ever happens, there's no room for Qatar to be involved in Gaza the day after. Now, whether the UAE or Saudi Arabia or other moderate Arab countries would be willing to be involved, I think it's largely dependent on the degree of Israel's success in the battle. And why do I say that? The UAE, the leadership of the UAE, of Saudi Arabia, knows perfectly well what Hamas is. The Muslim Brotherhood is outlawed in these countries. Al Jazeera, you can't watch Al Jazeera in the UAE. It's illegal, or it's outlawed. The real concern of Israel, but I think of some of these countries as well, is of a Hezbollah model in Gaza, where you have some sort of local or technocratic government that is the face of the whatever local government is happening in Gaza. But the real power, the real decision makers on the ground are Hamas. If Hamas survives, if due to international pressure, due to internal pressure, Israel does not go all the way and eliminate Hamas, then even if there's some technocratic government or local leadership who officially runs the place, Hamas will remain the real power brokers. And in such a case, I don't believe that the UAE or Saudi Arabia or any other country for that matter will want to get involved in this mess that's going to be there. If Israel is able to truly eliminate Hamas, not eliminate Hamas entirely because that's impossible, but to eliminate Hamas as a governing and a military force in the Strip, I believe in that case, these countries may be willing to be involved, and I think likely would. Now, the United States has been pushing very strongly for what I call a Ramallah for Riyadh deal, right? Israel accepts or advances the establishment of a Palestinian state. That Palestinian state takes control of Gaza as well. And in return, the US administration delivers normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and everybody goes to elections in November happy. I think that this is a highly unlikely scenario for three reasons. First of all, if we look at all the most recent polling, public opinion polling in Saudi, actually across the Middle East, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, it is incredibly negative towards Israel. Ties on the leadership level continue. We saw the meeting of Economic Minister Barkat with his Emirati and briefly with his Saudi counterparts just this week in Abu Dhabi, and we've numerous other indications. But in the latest polling from the Washington Institute, between 85 to 92% of the population in these moderate countries believes that October 7th was a win for the Palestinians, the Arabs, and the Muslims. Now, whatever you think of Israel's actions, seeing this as a win is truly not surprising, but I would say somewhat depressing. And the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS, and other leaders in the region do take public opinion into account, are cautious when it comes to the street, the media, which unfortunately the media, despite the incredible developments we've seen due to the Abraham Accords, the media in the region, even in these countries, has not changed significantly. And therefore, it's unlikely that in the next 6 months, there would be some kind of dramatic move to publicly normalize with Israel. We may see gradual steps of strengthening cooperation. In fact, I believe that we will see for a number of reasons, and I'll get into that at the end. But full-scale Abraham Accord style normalization, I think, is quite unlikely with Saudi Arabia. Two, the Israeli public at this point is strongly against the idea of a Palestinian state, and I don't see that changing. Doesn't matter who the government is, if we have elections, if we don't have elections, whoever the prime minister is. And thirdly, if we look at what's going on in Congress now, the difficulties of passing the supplemental of foreign aid for the Israel, Taiwan, Ukraine, remember that what the Saudis really want out of a Israel normalization deal is a US-Saudi defense pact. That likely has to go through to Congress. I think it's very unlikely that due to election year politics, the Biden administration will be able to get such a major commitment. You have to remember, Defense Pact is a major American commitment to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia. Despite the fact that there's a vast majority of members of Congress who support the Abraham Accords, who support peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia, I think that in an election year, it would be extremely difficult to gather the widespread bipartisan support for something which, again, for better or for worse, will look like will be a major achievement for President Biden if you could get it through. And it's unlikely that there would be bipartisan support for something like that. So even if Israel were to say to the Americans tomorrow, yes, let's go for this idea, I think for these three reasons, it is highly unlikely and shouldn't be seen as a realistic possibility, certainly not in the 6-9 months in the future. So where are we going? Where are we going next? And how can this potentially impact Gaza and even the Palestinian Authority in a positive way? Over the last few years, the Abraham Accords, the ties between Israel, the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, even Sudan to a certain extent, have been largely, to a large extent, bilateral. The future of regional cooperation, integration, normalization is multilateral. And what I mean by that, given what we've seen, given the war in Gaza, which will likely go on for a long time, remember, estimates of how many Hamas or how many terrorists in Gaza killed range. The defense minister has said 12,000. actual numbers may be a bit lower, 8,000, 9,000. Remember, Hamas and Jihad together have about 40,000 terrorists in the Gaza Strip. So we are still have a long ways to go if we truly intend, and I believe that we do truly intend, to eliminate Hamas as a governing and military force in Gaza. There's the war going on. There's public opinion, which is overwhelmingly negative. How do we move forward? The multilateral avenue, I believe, is highly promising. In the G20 meeting in September, right before the Gaza war, India, the United States, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and a number of other countries, European countries, launched the IMEC initiative, the India, Middle East, Europe Corridor Initiative. This is an idea, a grand vision of a corridor which includes transportation, logistics, communications, energy, innovation, connecting east to west and west to east, from India to Europe, from Europe to India. Now, clearly, such an ambitious initiative requires going through the Middle East rather than going by ship, let's say, all the way around to the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandab and the Houthis, or rather going northward where Iran and Turkey and Syria and Lebanon. You could connect India and Europe and the United States as well efficiently, quickly, safely, securely by going through the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, potentially even the Palestinian Authority, Israel, and potentially either the Gaza as well being involved. And this would be a revolution in global security, trade, resilience. And it would provide for countries where the bilateral track is currently difficult because of the factors I mentioned previously, it would provide, let's say, an excuse why we need to strengthen ties with Israel because of all the vast benefits that would accrue from this regional approach. We could see similar benefits from regional approach to energy, for example. The Eastern Mediterranean region could potentially be a major energy hub if you combine Israel, Egypt, potentially even Gazan, Cypriot energy resources. It could be a real alternative to Russian gas, which Europe wants to wean itself off of, energy supplies from other problematic countries. Again, the East Med gas, the potential of East Med gas or energy cooperation. In the future, we might even be talking about solar energy coming from the Middle East, which has a lot of sun for anybody who's been here, and being shipped potentially as green hydrogen through Israel to Europe. This will all happen only with much closer cooperation between the countries of the region. We're starting to see it happen on a small level. For example, we've seen an expansion of trucks coming from India across the Middle East to Israel, to the ports in Israel and off to Europe. But in order to really expand this, we need to really deepen cooperation. Now, in order to make this happen, it's going to be difficult. We shouldn't kid ourselves. Public opinion, the war, various sensitivities, Iranian pressure, Chinese pressure. Remember, this IMEC corridor is essentially an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, China's BRI. So China's expanding the BRI as a way of essentially showing dominance over global trade routes in key strategic areas. And the IMEC is a Western and Indian alternative to this. It's going to be challenging on all counts. And what I would suggest to all the people who are joining us, certainly everybody who's in the United States, who's in Europe, is that the more our American and European allies are proactive in conveying the message and taking practical steps to revitalize the Abraham Accords, the vision of regional cooperation, not just for both geopolitical reasons, and also for business reasons, and also for security reasons. The more our partners around the world, in India certainly, and we're in conversation with some people from India about this, are involved in restarting the momentum for regional cooperation, this will benefit Israel's security and prosperity, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all the countries in the region. And once we create this corridor of stability and prosperity and cooperation, there's certainly room. And once Gaza is de-radicalized and demilitarized, there's certainly room for integrating Gaza into this future vision of the Middle East. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Asher, for that broad overview of really the geopolitics right now in the war. Thank thank you to all of our viewers who are sending in the questions in the chat or emailing them to me. All the questions are, of course, appreciated. We'll try to get to as much as we can. So I want to go back to something you kind of began with. You mentioned that the UAE was at one point radical extremist, and then they made broad changes in their curriculum, which potentially caused them to become more moderate, if I characterize that correctly. So are you able to expand on that a little bit more to see how that would apply in Gaza? Meaning, what motivated the UAE to make those sweeping changes?
So indeed, the most of the early instructors, teachers in the UAE in the 50s and 60s were Palestinians, or many of them were Jordanians, who were radical, were related to the Muslim Brotherhood. My friends who are my age, in their 30s and their 40s, have told me that they remember growing up in high school, learning the most anti-Semitic stereotypes, the most anti-Israel demonization, and they're very grateful that the leadership, which enjoys a strong degree of legitimacy, which has been blessed with a very forward-thinking vision, realized that this would lead to instability, that this would lead to extremism, that this could lead to violence. This is not what they want. And they had the courage to, first of all, just literally, take these teachers and throw them out of the education system, throw them out of the judicial system. But that wasn't enough. The next step was creating this culture through education, through examples, through statements and examples by the leadership of multicultural respect and tolerance, instilling this as an ethos of the UAE. If you recall, the Abraham family house, which I mentioned briefly at the outset, which is this incredible complex in Abu Dhabi, where you have a synagogue, a mosque, and a church side by side, all at the same design, the same proportions, was initiated even before the Abraham Accords. It was initiated following a meeting which the UAE sponsored between the Pope and the leader of Al-Azhar University, a leading Muslim scholar, and this real commitment to multiculturalism. We see similar efforts in Bahrain. So in Morocco has a long tradition of Muslim-Jewish relations and very positive memories of that heritage. So there is a basis for this, but again, it will require getting the extremists out, and then through media, through schools, through religious leaders, spreading and deepening a very different message. I'll just finish up with one point. Hamas took over in 2007, right? So that's about 17 years ago. That means that pretty much, and about 50% of the Gazan population is under 18. That means that all the Gazan youth and about half the population grew up in the Hamas school system. So we have a very, very major challenge, but I believe that people can be educated, and especially when they see it in their benefit, in a more positive and tolerant manner.
Now, do you think the Gulf states have a vested interest in de-radicalizing Gaza? What's in it for them? Is it worth all that hard work?
There's the interest of the importance of the diplomatic leadership, of their commitment to the Palestinian people, but there's also two other elements here at play. One is the importance of regional stability. Saudi Arabia is investing a tremendous amount in developing the Neom province, right across the Red Sea from Egypt, from Gaza, from Israel. It's really, in a sense, it's almost it's a local Red Sea project. You fly there, and you look out the window, you see Aqaba, Eilat, and Sharm el-Sheikh, and not too far away from there, you see Gaza. Now, for that to succeed, it requires a vast amount of foreign investment, and that requires stability. Similarly, with this vision of tremendous prosperity and security by linking the entire region as an east-west corridor, is a tremendous vision. It's a practical vision too. It's starting to happen today, but it requires regional stability. As long as Hamas controls Gaza, as long as Gaza is radicalized, they'll be able to upend that regional stability whenever they or Iran or Qatar wants that to happen. So that's the other interest. And the last interest, these countries see the Muslim Brotherhood as their enemy. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt certainly. There have been Muslim Brotherhood affiliated leaders, Morsi in Egypt, Erdogan arguably in Turkey, but Gaza is the first real Muslim Brotherhood country that's run according to the principles and the vision and the ideals, values of the Muslim Brotherhood. Showing that this was a total and abject failure, first by Israel destroying Hamas and then building something, an alternative that's much better, will show the entire region that the Muslim Brotherhood is a failure and it's the wrong path to go. So for those reasons, I do believe they have an interest in seeing Israel succeed and seeing Gaza rebuilt in a more moderate fashion.
Now, in terms of the IMEC, building that trade corridor you mentioned, how does Egypt fit into that? Would Egypt use its power to fight against that, or to somehow push Israel out of the equation in that corridor?
Egypt would have a challenge insofar as if there was an expanded overland trade, there may be less traffic in the Suez Canal. I mean, but that's sort of happening now because the Houthis are I think, shipping in the Suez Canals are down about 40%, and that's why we're already seeing the expansion of overland trucking routes. But I think Egypt in the energy sector, in the food and water security sector, would have quite a lot to gain. I mean, the Egyptian government is facing a very severe financial crisis. It's essentially hoping for the IMF to bail it out. So this vision of regional, and certainly they themselves see themselves as threatened by the Muslim Brotherhood. So we'd have to find, there's different kinds of shipping. Some things are better for overland, some things are better by ship, some things are better by plane. It's kind of a logistics issue. So there may be some Egyptian concern regarding how this would impact traffic in the Suez, but for many other aspects of this, they would gain quite a significant amount.
Now, you're looking at the IMEC as a potential way to de-escalate conflict in the Middle East. Is it possible to look at it from the other perspective? We've had many guests on our briefing who have suggested that much of this war began because of the normalization process with the Saudis. So potentially, if these trade agreements come to the fore, is that going to embolden countries like Iran to more aggressively try to destabilize the region?
Iran will certainly work against regional cooperation and integration. We have to remember, for example, the Saudi-Iran diplomatic agreement came essentially after Saudi Arabia was unable to stop hundreds, if not thousands, of Houthi attacks, Iranian-sponsored Houthi attacks against its energy facilities, against its airports, against its cities. It saw the United States was not going to give it what it needed to stop with the attacks, and it's best, the best way to de-escalate and to achieve the stability that it needs to achieve its 2030 vision was by going the route of a diplomatic route. But I think this diplomatic agreement is really only skin deep. The basic suspicion and conflict, distrust between the Saudis and the Iranians, the Shias and the Sunnis, the Arabs and the Persians, still very much exists. In fact, at every Arab League meeting, there's a meeting of the committee, including Saudi Arabia, including Bahrain, including other countries, the committee to stop Iranian meddling in our affairs. And that's still going on. If we create this corridor, it should include a strong security component as well. And that would include what the Saudis are really looking for, which is the US defense guarantees and defense pact. If you remember, some of the early Houthi missiles fired at Israel were shot down by Saudi Arabia. At this very moment, you have Israeli missiles, the Barak air defense missile system, which is defending strategic sites in Abu Dhabi. So this corridor would not only be trade and economic, it would include a security component as well, and that would allow the moderate countries of the region to stand up to Iran and its proxies, and also give the United States and Europe and even India strong reason to do what was necessary to maintain that stability and that peace.
I want to ask you a theoretical question. I don't know if there's one answer to this, but if somehow the de-radicalization could occur in Gaza with that UAE model, if somehow a tremendous trade routes were set up with these countries, the idea of a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state, conceptually, is that a point that these countries would all require? Or do you think potentially that could go by the wayside if all of these other interests are met?
These countries are committed to the Palestinian people. They have no illusions about the Palestinian Authority. They seem to know better than many people in Washington or in Brussels about the corruption and failure of the Palestinian Authority itself. The fact is that the UAE has largely continued its ties with Israel, less so the public ties, but certainly the ties that are less public, despite the war and despite the lack of an establishment of a Palestinian state. And we saw the meeting between President Herzog and the president of the UAE on the sidelines of COP28 in November. All these countries will want to act for the benefit of the Palestinian people. Now, what a Palestinian state looks like, what a demilitarized state looks like, what a Palestinian autonomy looks like, I think there's room for discussion. There's room for presenting and explaining Israel's core security needs, Israel's core strategic outlook. I think that they will continue to promote what they see as the interest of the Palestinian people. And I think that it will be possible, again, we're talking about something that's demilitarized, de-radicalized, again, it's maybe entirely theoretical, led by a competent leadership that's looking to have peace with Israel, that's ended incitement. I think it's in such a unlikely scenario, but if it did in fact come into being, I think that Israel and the countries of the region could find a common understanding.
Asher, thank you so much for all this. I want to ask one final question, and then we're going to wrap it up. The state of the Abraham Accords right now, many months into this war, how are they?
So in terms of the leaderships and in terms of ties which are not public or not being publicly celebrated, they are largely continuing as before for the most part. The warm public celebrations and events and conferences that we saw in the past have largely stopped. Similar with Saudi Arabia, I've always felt that the likelihood of a grand deal, sort of a UAE style or Bahrain style grand normalization is less likely, or more likely to see as a step-by-step process of expanded cooperation, which becomes progressively more open and more public. I think these processes are happening, but we should have no illusions. The war has impacted them negatively, and like I said, both the leaderships and the people in these countries are truly committed to the Palestinian people, and whoever dismisses that, I think, is incorrect. And therefore, we are going to the degree that the next U.S. administration, that European powers and other allies of Israel, that individuals, private sector players, business leaders, cultural leaders, all these players who could play innovation leaders, who could play a positive role, both for ideological reasons, for idealistic reasons, and for business reasons, or security reasons, can play a positive role in putting the Abraham Accords and putting regional cooperation back on track and regaining the momentum that will only be beneficial for all the players involved, for Israel, and for the entire region.
Asher, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, of course, to all of our viewers for tuning into this briefing. It's been very enlightening, and I'm at least ending the briefing with a little bit of positive thoughts about what could come because of these strategic partnerships. So thank you for sharing all of that. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern time, to continue our briefings. Until then, everyone, stay safe, stay strong, take care.
Thank you very much.